Hey Froggy friends, Kirostyle here, and welcome back to Tales of Arise. It's been 2 years since Tales of Arise came out, and there's a DLC expansion, which is out, now called Beyond the Dawn. Now prior to Beyond the Dawn, the Bandai Namco Twitter page was tweeting out these links to little Prelude stories, which were released on their site. So today we're going to read over these, and it goes over what the characters have been doing in the 1 year interlude between the end of the main game and the beginning of the expansion. So I'm going to read them in the order that they were released. So the first one is Law and Rinwell, and you guys know I really like Law, he's a really cool character. So this one's called Two Who Remain the Same, released on November 3rd. There's a picture of our lovely characters and a Hoodle as well. Yeah! The shout of strength was accompanied by a heavy striking sound that reverberated across the clear blue sky. There was a feeling of satisfaction that came from precisely landing a blow on a foe's weak point. After a few seconds, the Zoogle let out a noise, and its massive body crumpled to the ground. Seeing the results of his work, Law let out a deep sigh and relaxed his posture. Alright, you can come out now. Law looked back at the trees, where a man trembling with fear emerged from the shadows. Strapped to his back was a large pack, indicating he was a Calaglian merchant. Are you sure it's okay? Yeah, I don't see any others. That's gotta be the last of them. Even with Law's reassurance, the merchant didn't seem to be able to shake his anxieties. He couldn't help but keep nervously glancing to and fro. To think I'd be attacked after making it this far without any problems. And they say Menancia was the safest area. It wasn't the first time Law had heard complaints like that. He scratched his head. There ain't nowhere you could be free of Zoogles. Menancia is just a little better off than most places. The merchant had known that, of course, but nearly getting devoured is a lot different than just hearing about it. Law knew the merchant was new to the trade and had never been as far as Menancia before. The Renans, who had ruled Dana until just a year prior, had brought various creatures called Zoogles with them to the planet. Even back then, it wasn't rare to find groups of Zoogles running loose, free from Renan control. Now all Zoogles were like that. A year later, when the two worlds of Dana and Rena merged, the Renans lost the ability to control Zoogles. It seemed to be related to the collapse of their celestial base, Lenegis. Law was sure he'd heard something about that, but he'd never been particularly interested. The important thing was that Zoogles were just as dangerous as before, and people were likely to run into them even on public highways, meaning that armed escorts was an absolute necessity. Relax, we made it this far. It's just a little further now, see? Law pointed towards the end of the highway that stretched across the grassy plains, where a large city surrounded by high walls was visible. A sigh escaped the merchant's lips. That must be Vicent, the capital of Menancia. It's as splendid as the rumors said. Suddenly, his expression darkened. I wonder if Ulzebek can be like that too someday. Depends how hard we try. How hard all of us try. I suppose you're right. The merchant regained his composure upon hearing Law's encouraging words. In any case, you really helped me out. I was pretty worried when the Crimson Crows said they could only spare one person, but thanks to you I managed to make it here one piece. Once a Calaglian resistance group, the Crimson Crows were now in charge of the area they had fought for. Even after being freed from slavery, many Donans were unsure how to build a life for themselves, so the Crimson Crows were petitioned with every kind of request imaginable. Though that issue was shared by organization groups in every region, Calaglia had always been particularly impoverished, so it had a severe shortage in resources and manpower. A certain number of escorts were needed to safely travel the roads, so requests by solo merchants tended to get put on the back burner. That's when Law decided to step in and offer his services. The merchant had been uneasy to have only a single boy as an escort, even if he was a member of the Crimson Crows. But he had also quite the business opportunity on his hands, and the boy did come with a glowing recommendation. After a great deal of worrying, he decided to accept the help in the end. Amazing how you took care of those Zoogles by yourself. I'm sorry for doubting you. That? Oh, it was no big deal. All I wanted to do was go to Vicent anyway, so it was a win-win for both of us. Elated at the compliment, Law tried to act humble. Truth be told, however, not many Donans could face even a single Zoogle on their own, let alone multiple Zoogles at the same time. Having made it through the war and the year that followed, there was no doubt in Law's strength, and he had calm and composure to match it. The merchant spoke as if something just occurred to him, perhaps due to Law's air of confidence. Come to think of it, doesn't Vicent have training grounds where fighters test their skills? Is that why you're going there? No, I just have a friend, someone, to see there. Law's voice suddenly trailed off and his eyes darted around. The merchant looked at Law with an understanding smile and clapped his hands together. Aha, so that's it. How rude of me to ask. No, you got the wrong idea. His earlier dignity now gone, Law's voice went up a pinch. His desperate denial had him acting his age, while speaking volumes about his true personality. Law cleared his throat and spoke as if to rush along the smirking merchant. Come on, let's get going before more Zoogles show up. All right, thanks again for the help. As he walked behind the merchant, who wore that knowing look on his face, Law scratched his head once more. He always ended up making a mess of things right at the very end. Whatever. He gave a small shrug and started walking, as to not let the merchant get too far ahead. His eyes were focused not on the merchant, but on the palace that towered above the center of his cint before them. His expression had changed, reflecting a complex mix of emotions. I wonder how she's doing. But due to the syntax here, then this term, it reverses the meaning. The voice in the corner didn't match the dimly lit room with its overflowing bookshelves. A large desk piled high with mountains of books, and on the other side, 2 dainty fists thrust up towards the ceiling. That feels much better. Now it all makes sense. I thought something was off there. Reclined against the back of the chair, Rinwell stretched out with a look of satisfaction on her face. Next to her, flapping and floating at head level, was the white Danon owl Hoodle, who seemed to have noticed something. Hoot hoot! Huh? Someone's here. Rinwell responded as if waking from a dream. What are you doing? Building a book fort? Rinwell remained in her celebratory pose, shifting her gaze to see who else could be in the room with her and Hoodle. The face that greeted her seemed exasperated at the massive mounds of books. Oh, Law! What are you doing here? What? Well, I just happened to be in the area on a job. Uh-huh. Is that right? In response to Law's insistence he was only here by chance, Rinwell made a big show of acting like she didn't care. She'd grown more strategic since they last met. I went to the trouble of dropping by. Couldn't you at least act a little happy to see me? Thinking he was being strung along, Law cleared his throat and cast his gaze over her desk. He couldn't even begin to guess how long it'd take to finish reading that staggering amount of books. Longer than he'd ever be able to be alive, that's for sure. So you've just kept yourself locked up in here? How do you not get bored? Easy. I get new insights and knowledge with each page I read. And just look at all the pages in all these books. It's like I'm surrounded by mounds and mounds of treasure. Rinwell raised both arms and gestured around the room. Massive rows of bookshelves were lined up, so many walls, and every shelf was stuffed to the brim with books. Some came with the Renans, while others were Danon books from before the Renan subjugation. Rinwell's eyes sparkled with excitement and euphoria. Hoot! Poodle's exasperated too. Don't you get tired from all this? Not really. But the book I'm reading now is a little tough. Wow, so there are books that even you struggle with. It was a frank compliment without a trace of irony. Rinwell was caught off guard by the honesty. It's not that hard per se, but it's a Danon book, so writing is really archaic. Rinwell's speech quickened as if trying to hide something. I mean, in the old days, Danons had different dialects, which varied from place to place. Even though nowadays Danons and Renans speak the same language, huh? Law's voice sounded distant. The Renans had come to another world to invade Dana, yet they'd always spoken the same language. In fact, this was because they'd been created from Danons. The ones who created them, the Helganquil, likely had a language of their own, but either the Renans physically couldn't speak it, or the Helganquil thought that having a shared language would help the Renans rule over the Danons. That was Rinwell's hypothesis. And then, over 300 years of rule, many languages and dialects disappeared, with the exception of the ones still in use today. That was all ancient history now. Law's eyes turned back to Rinwell's desk. He spotted something besides books. It was the dreaded remains of a half-eaten meal still on its plate, and the last traces of some sort of soft drink, or some sort of drink at the bottom of a cup. This could only mean... Wait a minute. When was the last time you ate something? Or for that matter, the last time you slept? Now that you mention it, I'm not quite sure. It's always dark in here, so it's hard to judge time. Rinwell awkwardly smiled. Law scratched his head and muttered under his breath, still loud enough to be heard. Sheesh, I take my eyes off you for 1 second and you end up like this. Seriously, I don't see how any of this is your... Hoot hoot! Hoodle interrupted with a rare hoot of protest. He glared at Rinwell, wings flapping intensely. See, even Hoodle's worried about you. Just get something in your stomach and go to sleep already. Okay, you two. Okay. 2 against 1. Seeming to recognize she was at a disadvantage, Rinwell nodded begrudgingly. As the morning sun rose from the other side of the mountains, a long, crooked shadow was cast by the light illuminating the city. People were out and about in the streets, even at this early hour. Merchants bustled around, setting up their stalls for the day. Even at a glance, Dahnans and Renans were recognizable by their clothing. And then there were enormous, armored soldiers whose silvery garb glistened in the morning light. The residents moved about without showing the slightest hint of fear for one another. Law sat on the steps leading down to the street from the palace, gazing absent-mindedly over the scene that stretched before him. It was the same as ever. Menancia, with Vicente at its center. The only place in the world where Dahnans and Renans lived together as equals. Menancia had achieved racial harmony even before the Dahnans were liberated. Now a year later, the city was seen as a pioneer. I wonder if Uzbek can be like that too someday. The Radiant City was the inverse of many problems experienced in other areas. Only a year earlier, the Dahnans had been slaves to the Renans. Law himself had played a role in bringing down that system, but it was too soon to expect anything to change. Law narrowed his eyes at the brightness of the dawn. So this is where you were. He raised his head to see Rinwell peering down at him. You're awake already? When I woke, it was morning and you were gone. I thought you left or something. Talk about a shock. Her tone sounded somewhat like a reproach, but standing there she seemed relieved to have found Law. As if I'd leave like that. Besides, you need to get proper rest. It was hard to tell if he was speaking from genuine concern or just making up an excuse. She was used to this kind of behavior. Rinwell sat down beside him without saying a word. After staring in the same direction for some time, she opened her mouth. Thanks. No prob. Silence again. The two listened to the bustling sounds of the streets. Law sensed something and turned to the side, only to find Rinwell staring at him. Was she waiting for him to say something? Illuminated by the morning sun, Rinwell's face looked somewhat different than usual. Suddenly, Law's throat tightened. Oh, that's right, I got delivery. He averted his eyes and searched through his pockets. He didn't see how Rinwell responded. He couldn't. A delivery? Yeah, this. He thrust forward his hand holding an envelope. A letter? Yeah, from Alphen and Shion. Shion? Her voice rose as she snatched the envelope from Law. She opened it, no longer even taking notice of him. Fed up with her behavior, Law wanted to mutter a complaint, but he couldn't help but smile as he watched her fervently read the letter. Whatever. At the end of the day, this was just how they were. No matter what might happen, this was where they were right now. Law continued to watch until she finished reading. Poodle, who'd been sleeping inside Rinwell's hood, opened his beak wide and let out a yawn, and then he went right back to sleep. So that is Law and Rinwell's prologue story. Okay, next up we have Kisara and Dohalim, Two Open to Change, Prelude story, released November 5th. So they say they would like to meet in Niaz. Interesting. His eyes still on the letter in his hands, Dohalim leaned against the back of his chair. There's not much time till the day we're to meet. True. And we'll need to depart immediately if we would like to go. Kisara nodded from the other side of the desk. The two were in a room in a building in Pelagian, the capital city of Ganeth Haros. Documents were scattered in an orderly manner on the table, and the surrounding walls were lined with bookshelves. It was a room specifically designed for office work. Kisara's armor couldn't be more out of place, yet it didn't seem to bother her in the slightest. Though her upright posture was marked contrast to Dohalim's, they were equally relaxed and looked at each other with the same gentle gaze. I heard another new group of Renans recently arrived. Can you afford to be away right now? Dohalim had been something of a representative for the Renans in Pelagian. He wasn't in a position to have much freedom, but he didn't show any distinct signs that it bothered him. I can't very well decline after you came all this way to tell me. That's not fair, Dohalim. In actuality, however, the contents of the letter weren't something they could ignore. It spoke of circumstances that couldn't be handled by anyone but them. The letter was from Alphen and Shion. They sent it to Kisara and Vicente, and asked her to inform Dohalim. And there was more. Law was to contact Rinwell. Rinwell lived in Vicente, just like Kisara. It was irrational to ask Law to come all the way from another city to talk to Rinwell instead of having Kisara do it. She didn't know whether it had been Alphen or Shion's idea, but she had an inkling of the intention. The letter had brought Kisara to Pelagian, where she was now face to face with Dohalim. Irrational as the request may be, this was the result. It was the same for Law, whether he put the pieces together or not. What about you? The troops will struggle with their captain away for an extended period. I don't plan on being gone long, and I left a list of drills for them to go over in the meantime. When I get back, I'll test them to see if they fall through properly. Quite responsible of you. If it were truly an inconvenience, Kisara wouldn't be in the room right now. They were both well aware of that. Drilling the soldiers who protect Vicente. That was Kisara's job now. She was supremely distinguished in combat and military matters, and also come to be seen as a role model. A perfect fit for a city where Danins and Renins lived together. Kisara was stern and unbending in her instruction. Dohalim felt a bit sorry for her soldiers. Though he would never say that out loud, of course. When I've said I'm going to Pelagian, everyone wants to know when you'll be back. I'm sure everything is running smoothly without me. It's not so much they need your help, but that they love you. They miss you. Everyone, you say. Dohalim turned to Kisara with a questioning look in his eyes, but Kisara evaded his query, saying nothing. Turning down the corners of his mouth in an almost sulky manner, Dohalim rose as if having given up. Well, you set a good example for me. Let me arrange the instructions and transfer of power for a while I'm gone. Kisara was already standing before he could finish, as if it was simply the natural thing to do. I'll assist you. For a brief instant, Dohalim appeared to break into a smile, but he quickly raised a hand to collect himself. I can handle it on my own. You won't have to wait long. How about going for a stroll? Exiting the building, bright rays of sunlight momentarily blinded Kisara. She cast her gaze around, eyes narrowed, and saw the towering fortress up ahead. Dalfaris Castle. It had once been home to the lord who ruled this area. The castle held deep meaning for both Danins and Renins alike. Being a lord himself, it was unthinkable that Dohalim would use it, but it was too big to tear down, and they didn't have the labor to spare anyway. Thus the castle kept its gates closed, and no one was allowed inside. How long would it take for this abhorrent relic to finally disappear? And which was better, to continue to remember or to forget altogether? Harsh memories can stir up pain, but they can also serve as a warning or a lesson. Kisara pulled out the old bracelet she carried with her. It was a keepsake of her brother that she always kept close. She gazed at it a moment, then gave it a squeeze as to confirm it was real, before stowing it away again. There were only a scattering of people walking the streets, most of them Danins who had come from other countries. Or Danins or people who had come from other countries. Pelagian was divided into 3 levels, with the original Danin residents and the Renins living on separate levels. Kisara was currently on the highest level. She recalled her conversation with Dohalim from just moments ago. She certainly trusted him, but her fears were not baseless. Kisara turned her head upward. She could see it floating higher in the blue sky than even the clouds, like rocks or rubble in the middle of a flowing river. Lenegis, the remnants of what had been the Renins' headquarters. Lenegis had been destroyed when the worlds merged a year earlier. The Renins managed to escape on their starships, but they were forced to rely on the Danins, who they had enslaved up until that point. Suddenly, the Renins found themselves without the slaves and machines upon which they always depended. Many lacked almost any of the skills needed to create things on their own. Ignoring Renins who resented this fall from grace would have inevitably led to further conflict with the Danins. So to prevent this, Renins were to be gathered together in one place, and Pelagian was selected as the host city. Dohalim was essentially the cornerstone to this policy. As the last lord, he can keep their opposition in check, while also acting as a buffer with the Danins to protect the Renins from any excessive disadvantage. In addition, he could instill self-reliance and lead the Renins towards a future of peaceful coexistence. That was the mission he undertook, and the vision of the future he held in mind. Still, though some Renins were cooperative, most were not. Having issues of her own in her job, Kisara found it frustrating. It had actually been a while since she'd be able to visit Pelagian like this. In any case, many things had changed since a year prior. Kisara surveyed her surroundings once more. Though it still resembled the Danin she was used to, it had become distinctly different. The most conspicuous change was in the sky above. It was something even more glaring than the ruins of Lenegis. It wasn't what was there, it was what had disappeared. Rena. The other of the twin worlds that had taken up a large portion of Dana's sky. Where it had been was now only vast blue sky, as if something had been left out. Dana and Rena had become one, but that didn't mean Rena ceased to exist. The spectacle reminded her that she was viewing the loss of Rena from her position on Dana. It was like that even for her, who had been involved in many events leading up to the current state of affairs. Then what must it be like for the majority of Danins and Renins? Not knowing what she was searching for, Kisara gazed intently at the sky. See something? Looking back, she saw Dohalim approach from the building's doorway. Quite the contrary. I see nothing. Her eyes returned to the sky as she spoke. Dohalim followed her example and did likewise. It's no different than the rest of the sky, but I can't help but feel there's a massive hole there. It's been a year, but it still feels confusing at times. I suppose that is to be expected. What we once took for granted is now gone. If Lenegis still existed, you wouldn't be here right now. Dohalim would likely have been stationed on Lenegis if it was still up and running, and getting there would require a starship, making travel no easy feat for a Danan. The starship Thalnets had been lost in the war a year ago. Standing alongside each other like this would likely be impossible, if it wasn't for what happened. Dohalim's being in Pelagian was a result of the unexpected destruction of Lenegis after all. Kisara pulled herself together and strengthened her inner resolve. She had to stay firm. Are all the preparations complete then? They are. I found the people to handle the pressing matters. There should be no issues with my temporary absence. Preparations for the trip are also complete. He sounded somehow proud. Kisara felt a wry smile about to form, but she did not allow it to show on her face. He was forging ahead just as he had sworn to a year ago. He seemed a bit sad as well, but joy and pride won out in the end. She would have to work just as hard as him. And with that, her brow abruptly wrinkled. Kisara? It was clear from his voice he'd noticed her change in mood. Disregarding his concern, she briskly walked over to him and pointed at his chest. My apologies, but your fastener is crooked. Ah, I must have been too much of a hurry. Now that I look closer, this one's off too. Do you always walk around like this? We're about to embark on a journey, Kisara. Perhaps this is where our attention should be focused. A messy appearance reflects a messy mind. We need to get this right away because it's the starting point of our journey. To be fair, I did think this was somewhat of an improvement. Kisara made quick work of adjusting his clothes as they exchanged words. No matter how much the world changed, this was one thing that hadn't changed at all. It was more a question of whether it would ever change. I do appreciate this. His abrupt, earnest comment caused her to raise her head, bringing them eye to eye. Appreciate what? Having things exactly where they belong. Kisara's hand stopped moving. It took a moment for his words to sink in. She closed her eyes. The energy seemed to drain from her body. She let out a small breath. Slowly her eyelids raised again. They now revealed a gentle gaze with a sense of companionship, but meant only for one person. Indeed. The two allowed themselves to be immersed in all that was contained in that one little interaction. Would the moment simply pass by and fade away? If so, how would that happen? This she didn't know. Even so, one freed from the past, focused solely on what was to come. The other sworn to serve as a shield, offering protection and support. Both living for the future, a future that gave them a place to belong. Forward. To the future. Not alone, even if their bodies were not physically together. Yet starting now, if only for a while. They shared a spontaneous smile and nodded. One extended a hand while the other accepted it. Let's get going, Do. So there's Kisara and Dohalim's prologue. And so lastly, we have Two Who Want to Change, Prelude story, released November 8th, for Xion and Alphen. Water droplets dripped down as if to mark the passing of time, a tranquil echo throughout the dark, rocky space. The dripping was soft, soon swallowed up by the cold dampness and returning to silence. Without warning, a new sound disrupted the quiet. It was the boisterous irregularity of splashing puddles, a contrast to the dripping droplets. Then the unmistakable sound of human breathing, and cloth scraping against metal. It's slippery. We'd better move slowly. Yes, you're right. Alphen and Xion. They strode through the gloomy cavern in contrasting clothes of black and white. Not everything in the cave was natural. In places there were signs of human activity, from sculptures to masonry, such as walls and stairs, seemingly half melted into the stone. Their complex forms created a peculiar dance of shadows in the swaying light of the fire. There were no signs of anything else moving besides the two of them, so silent as to be uncanny, yet they walked on unbothered, as if nothing could frighten them as long as they were together. This one has an interesting shape. Alphen spoke as they passed an engraved portion at the head of a toppled column. The ruins in these caves were parts of Dana's lost history. They were evidence of the civilization that had been destroyed 300 years earlier when the Renan subjugated the planet. How many ruins and relics like these remained? And how much could be reconstructed from them? Neither of them could even begin to guess. Rinwell might be able to explain if she was here. Yeah, It all's the same to me. Kind of embarrassing. Had he ever even seen any of this before? He'd seen the world of 300 years pass with his own eyes. He should actually know it better than anyone alive. But even if he tried to recall them, such memories completely eluded him. It was probably more a matter of interest than memory, and there was nothing he could do about that. Alphen. Shion's voice brought him back to his senses. At some point, they'd begun to descend a staircase. Their lamplight was reflected on the surface of the water up ahead. The path seemed to start going up again. You could see the top of the stairs on the other side of the water. Let's go along the wall. The two decided to advance along an outcropping of the wall slightly above the water's surface. If they proceeded carefully, it wouldn't pose any real danger. The water reflected back an image of the pair like a mirror. Shion stopped moving. Alphen took note and also came to a stop. Just as he was about to ask what was wrong, he realized what she was looking at. The surface to the water. So similar to a mirror. Alphen's face stiffened. The hollowing. The hollowing was what remained of matter after it had been drained of its astral energy, a void that only reflected its surroundings. When the two worlds merged, the vast expanse of hollowing that encompassed Rena had been brought to the new world. Though most lay underground, people sometimes discovered stretches of it, just like now. The hollowing became an all-new issue after the merging, since it made roads untraversable and plots of land unlivable. Considered to be the death of matter, much remained unknown about the hollowing, and it was considered best not to touch it at all. The two remained silent and resumed their traversal of the outcropping. Upon reaching the other side, Shion let out a small breath of relief. After continuing for a while, she opened her mouth to change the mood. Come to think of it, I wonder if our letters arrived safely. Don't worry, the merchant I entrusted them with is reliable. It'll be fine. Suddenly something came to mind, and he asked her a question. That reminds me, Shion. Why did you ask Kisar to tell Dohalim, rather than sending a letter to him instead? You could have done the same with Rinwell, too. Why? She seemed troubled for a moment, then a look of exasperation mixed with anger came over her face. He was such a simpleton. Because I found it unfair. Unfair? You found what unfair? This time she clearly raised her voice when speaking. Listen, they don't get to see each other as often as we do. Oh. Alphen finally understood, and his face grew tense. No, she couldn't be angry at him now. You think I'm meddling too much? Oh no, I don't think so. With that cleared up and ready to move on, Shion suddenly stepped on a small stone. Her foot slipped, sending her upper body backwards. Shion! Her hand extended reflexively in response to his voice. Alphen seized her arm and pulled her back forcefully. He got so carried away that he ended up hugging her against him. His incredibly earnest expression, the exact opposite of what had been moments before, came into Shion's view. Are you okay? Thanks. Even after she regained her balance, Alphen continued holding her hand. She'd been unable to come into contact with others for so long due to her cursed thorns. Now things changed so much she would reach out to others without thinking. Though she was still on guard around those she wasn't close with, it was a major change from just a year earlier. Though her slip had been a close call, this awareness of the past and present made Alphen happy. How did she feel about him? Shion suddenly, albeit carefully, so as not to seem cold, let go. Let's keep moving. We're almost at the exit. With that, she walked off briskly, as if to avoid letting him see the look on her face. Alphen followed frantically behind, worried she might stumble again. Upon leaving the cave, they found themselves bathed in gentle sunlight in an open area thick with plant life. A familiar sight on Dana, but the distance was something that hadn't always been there. A strange-looking structure, neither Danan nor Renan. It had been constructed by the Helganquil, the true Renans, just like the Hollowing. It was irrefutable proof the two worlds had merged. Similar to the Hollowing, the majority were buried underground in various places around the world, with just the top exposed above ground. Dots of light danced silently before the pair as they looked on. Astral energy. According to what they heard from Rinwell, these lights were likely the remnants of astral energy that had failed to materialize at the time of the merging of the worlds. They were energy that overflowed when the twin worlds and their 5 elements became one world with 6. It was a harmless and not particularly rare phenomenon, but it was yet another one that hadn't existed before the events of last year. Seeing this reminds me how much the world has changed. Yeah, said Alphen. The only thing that hasn't changed is people's hearts and minds. Shion heard a hint of cynicism in his voice and frowned. The battle a year earlier had changed the very nature of the world. They and their companions had played a major role in it all, which brought with it some degree of public notice. At the center of it all was Alphen, who especially couldn't go anywhere without drawing attention from Danans and Renans alike. Shion knew it wasn't something he'd asked for. She wanted to be close to him. Just as he once saved her, she now wanted to support him. But Alphen never tried to rely on her. Shion found it vexing. Now Alphen. Just as she began to speak, a scream rang out from the thicket. Ah! Help someone! What was that? By the time Shion called out, Alphen was already running. They drew their weapons as they ran, Alphen with his sword, Shion with her gun. It was clear they would be necessary from the sound of the scream. They spotted the person whose scream they heard right away, as well as the cause of that scream. A Zoogle. A big one, too. Its whole body was covered in thick bristles. Rising up on its hind legs, its front legs were lined with rows of razor-sharp claws. They could tell at a glance it was a formidable enemy. Its ferocious gaze was focused on a Danon in traveler's garb. Collapsed to the ground out of fear, he desperately tried to scramble backwards. Since the merging, none of the Zoogles could be controlled by Renins anymore. This made Danons and Renins equals in a sense. They were equally likely to be attacked, though for Danons this was nothing new. Zoogles now attacked everyone, regardless of whether they were Danon or Renin. Not that this single point of equality was something to rejoice about, of course. The Zoogle roared. Alphen decided to stop overthinking. Saving this person came first. Raising his voice to draw attention, he charged in, sword drawn. From behind him, Shion provided suppressing fire. She hit her mark, but the bullet was blocked by the thick fur and didn't go deep. So Alphen leapt in to slice his abdomen directly. What should have been a deadly strike was thwarted by its claws, which responded with a sharp sound. Sparks went flying. The claws blocked his metallic sword. If they struck flesh, it could prove fatal. This was a very strong foe indeed. But Alphen had faced stronger beings on countless occasions. This was hardly beyond his abilities. The corners of Alphen's mouth rose defiantly. Did the Zoogle sense it too? The beast suddenly shifted its focus from Alphen. It swiveled its head towards the traveler and went soaring into the air. In a single leap, it closed the gap between them. Damn! As Alphen cried out, its glaring gunfire passed overhead and hit the Zoogle hard. Once again the shots failed to pierce its flesh, but they did knock the Zoogle out of its mid-air pounce. A red light glowed in Alphen's hand. The blazing sword, his signature weapon. A torrent of flame that even burned the wielder. Yeah! Kicking up dirt, he drove a red-hot blow into the Zoogle from behind. No bristly hair could block this. The Zoogle shrieked, its whole body engulfed in flames. Burned from inside and out, it was no longer breathing by the time it hit the ground. Are you okay? Alphen addressed the traveler, who was still sprawled on the ground. Though dumbfounded at first, once he came to, he began nodding so fiercely his head seemed as it would fall off. Well, thank you. I got careless and lost my way, and then that Zoogle found me. I still can't believe I was safe with the legendary Blazing Sword. The Blazing Sword. The name made Alphen tense up. But having just escaped in an utterly terrifying situation, the traveler failed to notice. He'd be proud to tell his friends, he said. With that, and a repeated bowing of his head, he was gone. Alphen stood silently until the traveler was completely out of sight. Meanwhile, Shion stared at him. As far as the Danons were concerned, the Blazing Sword was the very symbol of heroism. The moniker came from his blade, his signature weapon. Alphen didn't like being called that. It was one thing Shion knew very well. Once he drew his sword, everyone knew who he was. Alphen understood this as well. Nevertheless, the two of them knew the Blazing Sword was necessary, since they had lost it once before. Alphen would use the sword without a moment's hesitation to help someone, despite what it meant for him. That's the kind of person Alphen was. And that's why she... Something wrong, Shion? He sounded worried. Yes, he was always like that, putting himself second. She wanted to do the same for him. She felt that way, again, right this moment. No, it's nothing. Shion gave a small shake of her head and smiled. Alright, let's go. For sure. I can't wait to see everyone. Hoot hoot. Doesn't look like we're forgetting anything. Indeed. I always know I can count on you. It'll be the first time we've seen each other in a while. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. A new journey in a new world. New encounters await with the start of a new story. To be continued in Tales of Arise Beyond the Dawn. So there we have it. All the prologue stories. Thank you so much for joining me here on this video. At the time of recording this video, I've already played the first 3 hours of Beyond the Dawn, and I'm really enjoying it. So keep an eye out for that video. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.